Hi, my name is Melissa Varga. I'm the Science Network Outreach Associate at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Science and Policy Change, Using Your Expertise to Influence the Policymaking Process. Our presenters will give an overview of how to create policy change, examples of different roles that experts can play in this process, and then talk a little bit about how UCS has helped experts utilize their expertise to make an impact on policy. After all of our presenters have spoken, there will be time for them to answer your questions at the end. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three presenters, starting with Kate Sell. Kate works with UCS members, supporters, activists, and experts to build support for the campaign efforts of the Climate and Energy Program. She specializes in engaging economists and health and medical professionals to help reduce carbon emissions. She also helped create the UCS Economist Network, as well as expand the organization's outreach efforts to Latinos and African Americans. Kate is the former director of Economists for Peace and Security, an organization that works with the United Nations on issues of peace, conflict, war, and the world economy. Next up is Dr. Daniel Pomeroy, a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow who currently works in the office of Senator Ed Markey, covering a wide-ranging portfolio including foreign policy, global security, and nuclear policy issues. He recently received his PhD from Brandeis University in June of 2012, where his research focused on building, testing, and running particle detectors to search for new fundamental physics phenomena as part of the ATLAS experiment at CERN. He served as a postdoctoral fellow on the Nuclear and Radiation Studies Board of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013, where he broadly worked on nuclear energy and nonproliferation policy research with a focus on safety and security of nuclear power plants. He also has extensive experience in grassroots political organizing, running LGBT rights campaigns and field offices during the 2008 elections. And last but not least is Dr. Dave Cook, a vehicles analyst in the Clean Vehicles program here at UCS. He specializes in both light and heavy-duty fuel economy. He conducts research on fuel efficiency technologies and the implications for oil consumption and greenhouse gas emissions across the transportation sector. Before joining UCS, he was a Merzion Science and Technology Policy Fellow and an Associate Program Officer with the National Academy's National Research Council. Dr. Cook recently received his PhD in condensed matter physics in 2010 from the University of California, Berkeley, where his dissertation focused on the fundamental science behind modern hard drive technology. So before we get started, just wanted you to note the chat box on the side of your screen where you can send questions to the presenters and to the moderator. Feel free to send us questions throughout the presentation, and then we will try to address as many as possible at the end. So before we kick it off, just wanted to get a sense of who is joining us today. So we have a quick poll. First, have you used your expertise to engage in the policy realm before? Go ahead and click yes or no. This can cover any number of different ways to engage in policy, so feel free. I'll give you a couple more seconds here to vote in this poll. I apologize to anyone who is joining us on the phone. You won't be able to participate in the poll, but I'll read out the answers to you and give you a sense of who's online. All right, a couple more seconds if you haven't voted already. Wow, we almost have an even split. All right, so people who have used their expertise to engage in policy before, almost 49%, and people who have not, almost 52%. So about 50-50 split. That's very interesting. Very good to know. So for the folks who have been involved in policy before, how have you been engaged? If you don't see an option on here that you've engaged in before, feel free to use the chat box. If you have, select the other. So has anyone submitted a public comment, sent a letter or an email to a policymaker, maybe met with a legislator? Looks like Elizabeth, who's on the webinar today, has been a part of a local advisory board. That's excellent. Pamela has done some radio tours on green energy. That's an excellent way to engage. I'll give folks a couple more seconds to vote in this poll. All right, I'm closing the poll now. It looks like a lot of people have supported organizations that advocate on different policy issues, which is excellent, but a lot of people have sent letters or emails to their legislators or decision makers. Many people have met with their legislators, have testified, have sent reports, so it looks like there's an interesting spread here. And this is a great, gives a great sense of who's joining us on the call, and is a good jumping off point for Kate to talk more about how we can create policy change. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kate. Thanks,
okay, great.
Kate.
Thanks a lot, Melissa. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Kate Sell. As Melissa said, I'm a senior campaign organizer in the Climate and Energy Program at UCS. And I'm delighted to talk to you today about how you, as Science Network members, are essential to our efforts to make and change public policy. Next slide, please. So here's our mission statement. The Union of Concerned Scientists puts rigorous, independent science to work to solve our planet's most pressing problems. So this means that we're not just an analysis and policy shop, and we're not just an advocacy group. We're both. And we think that's important because we believe it takes both approaches to open a policy window. Next, please. So essentially, this is how we at UCS believe policy change happens. We believe that changing policy is a three-legged stool, and each UCS program works on all three legs. So we have to define the problem, we have to develop solutions, and we have to work the politics. And I'll give you some examples of how our climate and energy team does this. Next, please. I think we've been real leaders in the nonprofit community in defining the problem. For example, way back in 2007, we undertook one of the first climate change impacts assessments in the United States, the Northeast Climate Impacts Assessment. And several Science Network members were co-authors of this. Next, please. And members of our staff and our Science Network are also authors for assessments by groups other than UCS, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Reports, next, and the National Climate Assessment. Next, please. So when we think about developing solutions, especially on the energy side of our program, we work on ways to reduce carbon emissions, particularly from the electricity and industrial sectors. Next, please. We work to reduce our reliance on coal, next, and to increase the renewable share of our energy mix, next. So we also work the politics. We try to shine a light on the varied interests that work against a concerted climate and energy policy in this country. Next, please. Some of these interests include our nation's historic dependence on coal, next. So here's one way that we work on that, by working for economic diversification in traditionally coal-producing states. Next, please. We work to shine a light on the role of oil and increasingly of natural gas. Next, please. So this is a report that we did on, sorry, I just can't quite see it, on the gas ceiling, as we call it, what's happening with expansion of our gas and sort of how we're beginning to over-rely on that as a bridge fuel. And finally, I think we think about how media coverage of these issues plays into public understanding and into the policy arena both. So an example of that is our recent report on science and spin, thinking about how cable news networks cover climate science. Next, please. We think about the way fossil fuel interests inject their considerable profits into the political system. Next, please. And we also think about how they tie into existing concerns about the size and scope of our government. In addition to those actively opposing climate policy, we also face a big challenge in, next please, what I call just plain old apathy. So many people have more immediately pressing concerns than climate change. At UCS, it's our role to alert them to the real risks of global warming, while empowering them to action. Next, please. So in 2010, it looked like we had a shot at comprehensive climate and energy legislation. But after that failed, we haven't seen any action in the House or Senate since. Right now, the policy vehicles are regulatory through the EPA and the Clean Air Act rather than legislative. So despite years of our working to clearly define the problem, to develop solutions, the policy window at the federal level is pretty stuck. So I want to talk a little bit about what UCS is doing to jimmy it open. Next, please. I'm sure many of you will recognize this famous quote from Speaker Tip O'Neill. And it's famous because it's true. All of politics really is local. And to bring the issue home to people, showing how it affects their daily lives, their wallets, their health, their kids, that's how we work the politics, and that's how we can succeed on that third leg. So one thing we're doing is we're working to localize climate impacts and solutions. And we're working to localize climate messengers, and that's one thing that we rely on you, members of our science network, for. Next, please. We're starting by sort of countering the misperception that climate change isn't happening or it's something that will happen a long way away from us, both in time and in space. Instead, we're talking about those impacts of floods, wildfires, heat waves, or droughts that are already happening, and where the scientific attribution linking the effects to climate change is particularly robust. Next, please. So we're also trying to make it clear that already climate change affects us in ways that we care about. So we did a series of reports a couple years back on climate change and public health. And climate change is worsening smog. Next, please. It's causing heavier downpours. Next. And exacerbating heat waves. Next, please. More recently, with our Landmarks project, we tried to tap into people's love of their American heritage, of historical and cultural sites around the country that are affected by climate impacts such as sea level rise, wildfires, and heat. So we're trying to make the case that acting on climate is patriotic. Next, please. And like most UCS products, the Landmarks report simply wouldn't have happened without extensive review from members of our science network. You can see on this slide how many folks from the network were involved. Next, please. And some of these folks did press interviews on the local climate impacts. This report did really well. We got thousands of stories in gratifying places. Next, please. And surprising ones. This is actually one of my very favorite media hits because we reached people whose primary concern is really different from ours, as you could tell if you saw the way most of us dress. Next, please. Now I want to give you a very concrete example of how Science Network members are localizing the politics, in this case in the state of Florida. So in the last couple of years, we've heard leading politicians ring a lot of variations on this "I'm not a scientist" theme when they're asked about climate change. So recently, Florida Governor Rick Scott was asked what he thought about climate change, and you guessed it, he responded he was not a scientist. So a group of 10 scientists, next please, including members of the Science Network, responded, I thought, perfectly. The simple message, we are scientists and we want to explain this to you, is the best answer to this dodge. And Science Network members from within the state are uniquely positioned to carry this message. And it works. Next, please. So Governor Scott did take the meeting with the climate scientists. It's really important, I think, for all of you to remember that UCS staff, even with all the considerable scientific and outreach expertise that we enjoy here, will never be as effective at carrying local messengers as local scientific experts will. Next, please. It's quite clear that in statewide races, our strategy to lead with the current and short-term impacts of climate change is effective. So this story from the New Republic goes on to explain that as Floridians experience climate change firsthand, their understanding of the threat changes. Rather than looking at it as a faraway issue, they begin to feel the impacts in their livelihoods and homes. It's no wonder that the governor now considers it bad politics to dismiss sea level rise when Florida's entire south coast faces crucial decisions of how to adapt to the changing climate. Next, please. Now here's another story from Florida. It's interesting to watch how this same "I'm not a scientist" quip is playing out with Senator Marco Rubio, who's a potential presidential candidate in 2016. So back in 2007, Senator Rubio strongly supported cap and trade as a federal climate and energy solution. But now there are many scientific issues that he seems to be struggling to negotiate. For example, he was asked about evolution and the age of the Earth, and he answered, "I'm not a scientist, man." On climate change, his views have also been fluid. So in January of this year, he went from being not a scientist to being someone who was ready to argue against the well-established scientific consensus on climate change. And by May 2014, he told CNN that he understood there was a vast consensus of scientists that are saying that human activity is what's contributing to changes in our climate. So again, I think we can see the pressure causing politicians to shift. Next, please. But here's the thing. We can't have an argument about policy solutions as long as we're stuck on the stool leg of defining the problem. So we're using the climate impacts message. Here's how global warming is affecting us right here and right now. And we're finding that especially when that message is conveyed by local experts, it's a tremendously effective way of pushing past the problem definition stage to developing solutions and creating political consensus. One of my mentors told me that whenever you give a presentation, you should always use the words "in conclusion" because those words give people hope. So in conclusion, UCS depends on members of our science network for each of the three legs of the policy change stool. We need your scientific expertise as sources and peer reviewers for our analysis, and we need you as informed, credible messengers that can educate policymakers and the public. So next, please. I'd like to ask that you please stay in touch with us. My colleague, Melissa Varga, coordinates our science network, and depending on your query, Melissa will put you in touch with the right analytic, political, outreach, or media staff to help you. One of us will help you figure out where your policy lever is and how best to press it. So thanks very much for helping us crack open that window. Now I'm going to hand you over to Daniel Pomeroy.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to start off with the sort of usual disclaimer that I am not speaking on behalf of my office here working for Senator Markey or even my fellowship. I'm just going to talk to you as a scientist who used to work in particle physics and tell you why I believe that scientists need to be involved in policy and politics. And to do that, I just want to give a brief illustration of one of the reasons that I think that's important. And so as scientists, we all know that we develop a hypothesis, and then we go out and collect data to test that hypothesis. But early on in my coming to DC and doing informational interviews, I had a congressional staffer tell me that working in Congress is a lot like science, because in Congress you come up with a hypothesis and then you find data to support that hypothesis. And I think the fact that everybody on this call can probably tell the difference between those two statements is why we need more of you working here or helping people who work here. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the three ways that I've seen scientists be involved with the work that we do in Congress. First, I'm going to talk about becoming a policy advisor, which is what I do, which also will outline how congressional staff work and give you an idea of what congressional staff do. Then I'm going to talk about the role of experts providing advice to policymakers and staff. And then last, talk about the role of outside groups working to lobby Congress, like the Union of Concerned Scientists. So next slide. So I am a AAAS Congressional Fellow for people who have PhDs in science and are interested in working directly in policy. It's a great way to make that transition. What I do is basically work as a congressional staffer for Senator Markey in this case, but there are about 30 of us spread throughout the Hill every year. And each one of us gets a whole portfolio of issues, just like any other congressional staffer. And I think the really important takeaway for this is that congressional staff have very wide-ranging portfolios. So for example, my portfolio is nuclear policy, which includes everything from nuclear nonproliferation policy to nuclear weapons budget spending to international nuclear cooperation agreements to nuclear safety and security of power plants to nuclear waste issues. In addition to that, I also do privacy regarding the domestic use of drones. I do science advocacy and funding issues generally. I do international LGBT rights, and I also recently, about a month or so ago, was given the entire foreign policy portfolio. Luckily, there's only a few things going on in the world, and so I've been a bit busy with that. Also why my slides are a bit boring compared to the last ones. In any case, a congressional staffer is required to be able to answer basically any question that arises within their portfolio. Ideally, you want to be able to know that answer off the top of your head. However, if you don't, the most important thing to have is a network of people you can go to quickly get you the answer, which is where experts come in, and I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. In addition to sort of just being on top of all the issues in your area, you also work to advance your office's agenda by writing legislation, letters, editorials, speeches. You build coalitions with outside groups, and obviously work with other congressional offices with all these things you do. So those of you who are interested in working on the Hill, that's sort of what it entails, and anybody who interacts with staff on the Hill, this is what people are doing here. Next slide. That being said, if you don't want to come to DC and you really love your science, I highly encourage you to stay doing that because there is an important role for outside experts to provide advice to people who work on the Hill. I think the biggest takeaway here is that experts have the time to really understand things in depth in a way that we with such large portfolios cannot. Therefore, they're often called in to brief congressional staff on an issue, to testify to senators and congressmen at hearings, and congressional staff often will reach out to them when they have questions. So for an example, or as I was saying, if I don't know an answer, I usually have an idea of someone who will, and I'll give them a call and get an answer. In addition to that, the people I trust well as outside experts, and I know their stuff really well, I will have them review internal documents sometimes before we release them, so legislation, that sort of thing, make sure that experts have a look at it and can weigh in on it. Finally, again, because experts have that in-depth knowledge, they can write detailed reports that we can use as references to back up any of the things that we say and basically do the deep digging that we don't have time to do. So the next slide. The other important way you can interact with Congress is by becoming part of a group and lobbying Congress to do something. I say become a part of a group because on your own it's really hard to lobby people. But if you represent a group, so for instance maybe you're a professional society or something like that, you represent a known constituency that will have some amount of clout and will be taken more seriously than just an individual scientist. Outside groups do a lot of things for us. One of the big things is that they organize briefings for congressional staff where they have sort of that panel of experts that I was talking about on the last slide come in and explain things to us. They also work to lobby Congress and are very effective at that. They can write reports themselves, and they can also say things that maybe we can't say. So they can reach out to other offices and put pressure on them in ways that we can't, especially if they represent a constituency that that office represents. So next slide. Next slide. There we go. I think this quote really sums up everything you need to know about how to work with Congress, both as an expert and lobbying Congress. So I actually stole this from a recent UCS conference that I went to. It says, for policymakers, you need to get the right information to the right people at the right time, and it has to be on one page. And there are 4 different concepts in here, and I'm going to go over those 4 concepts in 2 different ways. So as an expert, the right information. What this means is that we need experts to be accurate when they give us answers. That includes saying, I don't know if you don't know. The worst thing is to get an answer from an expert and have them be wrong, because we don't have time to fact check an expert. We trust them to get us answers. So accuracy, right information, the right people. For experts, that's kind of simple. It's whoever asks you. The right time is typically yesterday, and so I can't stress the importance of getting that quickly. So people who can respond to my questions in less than 30 minutes will become a higher priority for me, and I will rely on them more, and therefore be more likely to include them in discussions that help formulate policy. So I know academia, having been there, is usually more thoughtful and deliberative, but speed is really of the essence here. When we go to outside experts, it's because we need the answer and we need it now. On one page, important thing to know from an expert's perspective is we just want the answer. We asked a question, we want the answer, and if you include some links with some background in case we need to dig in a little bit more, that's great, but shorter is always better. Again, we trust you to be experts, so we trust your answer. Analyzing this quote from the view of a sort of science lobbying perspective, the right information, this goes back to everything being local. The more you can tie it back into local constituents and why people in our state or district would care, the more likely we are to act on that. The right people, this involves figuring out who the champion of your issues are. So for this, you can often look at what committees your representative sits on, or look at who sits on the committee that would oversee your issues. So if you don't know about congressional committees, just look them up real quick. It's pretty straightforward. But that's how you can figure out what senators and congressmen really care about, is what committee that they're on. The right time, it's really important to keep in mind that it's hard to do anything legislatively or on the Hill if there isn't public pressure to do it. So even if you have the greatest idea in the world, if it's not sort of in the public consciousness and being talked about, it's hard to really get much done. And then finally, on one page, I can't stress enough the importance of one-pagers. They are basically the currency of Congress and how we communicate with each other. So last slide. Next slide. There we go. So that's 90% of my tips. These are just a couple other things off the top of my head. Again, be trustworthy. If we share some information and say don't share it, please don't share it. Here's some tips for setting up a meeting. You can just call that office and say, who covers this issue? And they'll give you a name. And then there's very standard email names that you can contact them with, and people respond to emails. Third is this concept of bluff, which for some reason I put an extra F there. Bottom line up front, this is something scientists are typically not the best at, but you want to put your punchline at the beginning of any sort of written thing or anything you say. And then finally, again, connect it to local constituents.
Great. So while Dan and Kate talked about how one of the ways in which scientists can engage in policy discussions is through active engagements with groups like UCS, and that can help amplify and target their voice. I'm going to turn a little bit on that and talk about how UCS as an organization can work with other NGOs together to help support and multiply our efforts. Coalitions of NGOs can work together, playing off each group's strengths as well as utilizing each group's audience. And so in that light, there are essentially two ways that we as an organization tend to think about coalition engagement. The first of these is what I would call the foundation of technical support and analysis. Typically, we work with coalitions around a specific goal, and often it is UCS's role to provide either in part or in whole the technical support, which will then drive a prescribed action. And the second role is a support role. And here we rely on our supporters, like you, to help transmit any analysis and in turn perhaps drive and work on public comment or other types of interactions like Dan and Kate have already talked about. And so to put these two roles in context, I'll walk you through an example of a project that UCS worked on. I work on vehicles, so this example is focused on that sector. But generally, these sorts of regulatory situations are similar across the many areas in which UCS works. So way back in 2007, when Congress was still passing laws, they passed the Energy Independence and Security Act, or ISA. And within that law, it pushed the Department of Transportation to update fuel economy standards, setting a maximum feasible average fuel economy standard. Now for us, this was a huge win. Fuel economy standards for cars had remained flat for over 2 decades, and we had just a few years prior actually failed to increase them through congressional means. And so, however, now it set us sort of on a new path. Now we needed to look at how fast we could improve fuel economy in the United States and how we could make sure that the regulatory agencies act to ensure that this improvement truly is the quote-unquote maximum feasible. And so we took this analytical problem on after ISA, and we actually began a partnership with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and we worked together to write the Road Ahead report, which talks about the benefits of strong fuel economy standards and looks at technologies that we could do that would be necessary to move down this path. And so by working with another technically minded group, it grows the analytical resources available to us and helps strengthen our case and helps to unify that analytical position, which means that when we have the opportunity to speak with EPA or the Department of Transportation, that we're now speaking with a louder voice. And in this instance, the position developed by NRDC and ourselves grounded what would become the Go 60 campaign, which was named because it aimed for a fuel economy standard of 60 miles per gallon. So the Go 60 Coalition is a diverse group of NGOs interested in ensuring that the strongest fuel economy standards be put in place. At its primary core, it consisted of a number of groups that UCS works with regularly, including the Safe Climate Campaign, National Wildlife Federation, the Sierra Club, Environment America, and of course NRDC and ourselves. However, Go 60 was a much broader coalition than that. In addition to the science-based organizations like UCS and environmental organizations that I mentioned, we also had groups that work on, for example, security issues. So energy security is one of the major reasons why we have fuel economy standards as way back as the 1970s. We also worked with consumer groups like the Consumer Federation of America and Consumers Union, who are interested in strong standards because of the fuel savings that can be had for consumers. And then we also worked with environmental justice groups like We Act, which focus on the impact of environmental standards on, say, low-income communities. We worked with labor groups like the United Auto Workers, and we worked with faith-based groups like the Evangelical Environmental Network. And so this is, again, a broad coalition of supporters. Now, in addition to these groups, we also, one of the reasons why Go 60 was successful is that we also reached out to individuals to help support the standards. So we had letters of support from Republicans, including former governors, congresspersons, and EPA administrators. We also had a letter from 100 economists, including a Nobel Prize winner. We had letters of support from business leaders. And we also had a letter of support from scientists and engineers urging the administration to set strong fuel economy standards as a meaningful way to address climate change. And I don't know, but perhaps some of you on this call were even signatories of that letter. In the end, while we didn't quite hit 60 miles per gallon, we did come close. The administration set strong fuel economy standards of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. And there are a few key reasons why I think Go 60 was such a successful coalition. First, we utilized strong relationships. With the UAW, we were able to leverage their support for the standards to help put the automotive industry on a more supportive path. And as a science-based organization, UCS was able to leverage our analytical capacity to give folks like UAW the ammunition that they need. We also had an efficient use of assets. While we have some relationship with automakers, for example, that isn't our core competency. Consumer Federation of America is much more capable of doing some economic calculations, for example. And by playing off each other's strengths only, we can more effectively move the conversation forward. And having a broad consensus was crucial. As we've seen with some of the climate change arguments, having a large group of people making your case gives it more weight. One of the ways we got the most traction was from a strange bedfellows type of argument. If all of these different types of groups are in agreement, it lends more weight behind what we are saying. And the audience, doesn't have to just listen to UCS's case and framework for the problem. They can listen to the perspective of environmental justice advocates, labor groups, security groups, and so on for why the strong standards are so important to the U.S. And this is why there is strength in a single voice. The message was always crystal clear. We can get to 60 miles per gallon. The benefits of this scenario can be tailored to each group's audience, but there was always a resounding message set forth that every group could echo. And so now when we think about why you should engage in a coalition and how to make a coalition work, you can reflect on some of those same key points. So having strong partners with alternate perspectives can provide for creative ways to spread your message and bolster arguments you might not be aware of. It can also provide additional capacity and understanding on tangential issues that you might not typically work on. So when organizing a coalition, it is important that you work to your own strengths. Looking outward for an additional resource can help you determine who you need to contact to form a coalition, and it can keep you working on what you excel at as opposed to what might be better farmed out. And so these last 2 points go together. As I mentioned earlier, broad consensus can be a tremendous way of getting your message out there. However, it is also important that the consensus does not dilute the message. And so this is why it is crucial early on to identify a shared goal. So while you want a breadth of members, you do not want to grow the group at the expense of a strong message. And so in the case of Go 60, getting everyone on board early with 60 miles per gallon set forth by UCS's technical analysis set essentially the entry point to the discussion. Are you on board with setting a strong standard that gets us to 60 miles per gallon by 2025? Great, come on board, we need your help. And then having that concise message that everyone coalesces around helps set the tone for the discussion and makes the coalition as strong as possible. And so hopefully that helps explain why UCS works in coalitions and why they might be helpful to you. But there are lots of ways in which scientists can get involved, as we discussed. And so now I think we're ready to take your questions.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think we have time for some questions, and some folks have already been sending them in. Thanks so much. Feel free to send in any questions that you have to our speakers to the chat box, and hopefully we can get to most of them, although probably not all of them. So to start it off, we have a question from Stephanie, and this is directed towards Dan, but Kate or Dave, feel free to jump in. Stephanie's question is, do you recommend continuing in a postdoc if you don't want to pursue a bench work career after your PhD? Dan, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure that I completely understand the question. I mean, if you don't want to pursue bench work, I would say get out of it sooner rather than later. So I would say, there are a lot of opportunities outside the world of academia to do really interesting and influential things. So I would definitely recommend looking at all of your options. I think far too often in the sort of science PhD world, you think PhD equals tenured professor, and I think there's a lot of other things you can do.
Great. All right, let's take a question from Beth. She asks, who chooses experts to testify at hearings? Do Democrats and Republicans on a committee each choose their own experts?
So this is actually a question I had when I first got here. The answer is the chairman of the committee will choose the experts to testify. So in the House, that would all be Republicans, and in the Senate, it would be Democrats. Typically, the chairman will allow the minority party one witness, sometimes maybe more, to come as well, and we'll let them pick one. But the majority of the experts will be chosen by whoever chairs the committee, and therefore whoever is the majority party.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Dave Marvin. How do scientists become an outside expert for policymakers? This is something that was mentioned, I think, in everyone's presentation. So Kate or Dave, do you want to jump in on that?
Sorry, I was on mute. The question was how you become an outside expert?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Dan covered this a little bit in the beginning of his presentation when he suggested that you call up your legislator's office, ask who it is who works on this issue, and then start building a relationship with that person. And I think, as Dan said, once you've sort of offered yourself in that role, if you want to continue in that role, you do need to be prepared to respond quickly and briefly and accurately.
Yeah, and I would just like to sort of advertise, the Science Network again, in that, we draw upon the science. Occasionally we direct people. An office will contact the Union of Concerned Scientists, know that we work on this topic, contact us for advice on who to talk to, and so if you are connected with the Science Network and you have a particular policy area in which you're interested in, we may draw on that for our own work, where, if you go to, for example, contribute to a public comment period in your area, or, we do get requests on occasion from offices for experts, and so having you connecting with UCS, enables us to then reach out to you and do so by using our established relationships in a way that can benefit sort of our network of experts as a whole.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Dave. And the best way for anyone in the Science Network or anyone who's interested in getting more involved in policy to start building that relationship with UCS is for them to email me. I'll send my email in the chat box. Feel free to just send me a quick email letting me know, how you want to get involved, what your issue area is, what sort of level of engagement you're interested in, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the right people at UCS so we can start building up those relationships. Great. So another question we have, again about being an outside expert, is how do you establish yourself as an outside expert? How much experience would you say is needed? Scientists tend to be humble and might not think of themselves as experts. Does anyone want to tackle that question?
Well, I could start. So it sort of depends. If you're on the academic track, I would generally not ask people to take policy prescriptive actions until they were tenured, because it can be complicated for people. But everyone's work can be policy relevant, and so what I try to do is to think about ways that anyone's research at whatever level, master's, PhD, or post, can be useful or relevant to the policy discussion that's going on. And again, as Melissa said, I think, the better that we get to know folks and what they're interested in and what they're working on, the easier it is for us to sort of make those kinds of connections and opportunities available.
Can I also just add that, so the concrete example, one of my best experts for nuclear waste policy for the last year was a grad student. So in terms of who I reach out to, part of the reason he was the best is he was really involved in this particular issue, but also because he, as a grad student, had the time to respond to me immediately and fairly accurately, very accurately, but fairly detailed whenever I needed him. So I think there's no barrier to grad students or anybody involved with science who really has an expertise to be useful to people on the Hill. There's no magic degree that gets you there. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to take another question. This question is from Ted. When does a coalition go to its base for advocacy or support versus lobbying Congress directly? So I think that was directed at Dave, but Kate, you might also want to weigh in.
Yes. So usually it depends on what the regulation is in particular and where it's at in the stage of in the process. So, for example, I'm working on fuel economy regulations right now on heavy-duty vehicles, and there is no proposed rule yet. We are in. We know, the President announced in February that EPA and the Department of Transportation are working on this issue. So we know they're right now formulating a rule, and that rule is due in March. And so after there's a rule on the table, then there's something for which we can go reach out to experts, and they can comment on the validity of the rule, on the technical side of the rule. There will be a 60 or 90-day period where there's a window for public engagement, and so that's when we will typically, that's sort of at the rule has been finalized, has not been finalized, but it's been proposed, and then we can reach out and there's something to work on. In the interim, we typically, but that's on a regulatory issue, and so Congress is essentially not involved on that unless they are trying to mess with the agency's rule. and so, but again, that usually happens either after the process or it might happen during the process. We get a wind that, for example, a congressional office might be threatening an amendment essentially that could affect a regulation that we're working on, in which case then we'll directly, that's a sort of rapid response, and we'll immediately engage congressional office. But or if there isn't a rule on the table and we think that someone should push on it, that you might be engaged. You might engage the executive branch. You might engage the legislative branch. It kind of depends. So there's no sort of one point in time where we engage with one side or the other. You're kind of always keeping your ear to the ground and trying to figure out who is best to address when. But in terms of engaging in our support network, that tends to be after the rule has been proposed, while there's time for public comment.
Great. We've been getting quite a few questions about maintaining scientific integrity while engaging in science policy. Specifically, how can I engage in science policy while still maintaining a reputation of unbiased scientific integrity? Dan or Dave, do you want to answer that?
I don't view those things as being in conflict. I have kind of a long answer to this, but I think that scientists are reluctant so in my first slide I said scientists should be involved in policy and in politics, and I didn't really get into the politics side of things, but I think scientists are reluctant to get involved in politics because they're afraid of sort of making science seem like a partisan issue, or seemingly giving up scientific integrity. I don't think that those are necessarily exclusive. I think science has become a partisan issue. That is not the result of anything science has done, and I think scientists should fight for science to be taken seriously, and if they fight hard enough, they can move past the partisan divide. My best example for that is I ran a lot of campaign offices for LGBT issues, particularly around same-sex marriage. When that issue first started, it was clearly a partisan issue, but LGBT activists were able to show that if you didn't support the issue, you lost your seat. And therefore, Republicans now are starting to come out in favor of same-sex marriage. I don't see why science couldn't use a similar model where they say, if you don't support science, we as a society, and especially in the United States, we're built on science, you're going to lose your seat. And then it wouldn't be a partisan issue anymore. But I think that science needs to do a bit more organizing before we really get to that level.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe two more questions. This one I think would be best directed to Kate. Is it best to approach policymakers about an issue you believe needs attention, or should you first approach the public or the media for making people aware of the issue and then go to policymakers?
That's a really good question. I think it sort of depends on the moment that you've identified. In other words, if you think that this is a really important issue, but you feel like you're lonely, you don't know who else is in coalition or concerned about this issue with you, then I think you're probably going to need to work to build public support before you can get most policymakers' ear. The exception would be is if you know of a reason why this is particularly and maybe personally important to the policymaker that you're thinking of reaching. And sometimes, this particularly very often happens on issues of public health or medical research, that if you can find a policymaker whose family has been implicated or affected by that disease, then they can sort of be a champion for you and help you lead the public towards. I hope that's answering the question.
Yeah, that's great. I think we're going to wrap up with this one last question. What's the best practice a graduate student or someone who is new to science and policy realm, how can they develop policy advisory skills when they're new to this area?
Well, I could take a really quick crack at that and then let the actual scientists say, but I think what Dan talked about, the bluff model, just sort of taking your typical academic paper where your conclusion is at the end and turning it on its head and having that come first, really, and trying to write as clearly and plainly as you can. I would take a look at UCS's guide for scientist communication. Maybe, Danielle, or you could put the link up for that. We have several sort of guides and tips and tricks that you can use that will help you do that better.
If you want a fun assignment, try to condense a 500-page report to one page. I think that's something that all scientists could use help doing in the sort of very specific. My old boss, I worked at the National Academy of Sciences before this, which assembles panels of academics to write these very long reports, and then at the end he would always force them to condense it down to one page. And oftentimes he would get pushback from the academic saying, "You can't possibly condense this 500-page report down to one page." And he would respond, "Well, either you can condense it down to one page for Congress, or an 18-year-old intern will condense it down to one page. Either way, it's going to end up on one page." So I think that's an important skill. Also, another practical thing I would say is get involved. Get involved with your professional society. Get involved with the Union of Concerned Scientists. All these sort of organizations need help, and they do policy-relevant work. I think I didn't even realize in grad school that the American Physical Society, for instance, does a lot of policy work and makes policy statements and does lobby days on the Hill. These are all really easy ways that graduate students can get involved. They're always looking for help.
Great. We also had a lot of other questions that unfortunately we didn't get to today. Many of them related to how you can transition into a career in science policy, and we're actually holding a Google Hangout on September 25th that will address some of those questions. So feel free to join us. The link I'll pop up on the screen at the very end. So I want to thank you for joining us. I'll be sending out the link to this webinar, to the recording of this webinar, hopefully next week, if you'd like to rewatch it or pass it along to colleagues. And I'll be including in that email some of the resources that we mentioned on the webinar today. And before you go, I wanted to let you know that there are a couple of ways that you can put the skills that you learned today into use right now to get involved in policy change. You might want to consider joining the over 250 scientists and experts who have already signed on to our sign-on statement calling for increased public investment in agroecological research. So if this is your area of study, if you are an individual holding a doctorate degree with academic or professional experience relevant to agricultural systems, you might want to visit the short link on this slide and join our sign-on statement on this. If you're in Minnesota, if we have anyone from Minnesota on the webinar today, you can join the effort to call on public officials to support an increase in the state's use of renewable energy. This is something that's going to be ramping up in 2015, and we need a lot of help from experts on this. Our Midwest office is organizing meetings with legislators, prepping a rapid response team of scientists, and looking for signers for a professional sign-on letter for this campaign, as well as experts who want to get involved in other ways. So if you're in Minnesota and you're interested, please send us your email in the chat box or send me an email afterwards, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with them in the Midwest. And you may have seen our latest report on Rocky Mountain forests at risk. It just came out this week. One of the ways to address the climate impacts facing forests is for Congress to create a climate resiliency fund. So visit the short link ucsusa.org/forests-at-risk, and at the bottom there's an action for you to urge your senators to protect our forests by passing a climate resiliency fund and supporting policies that reduce global warming emissions. And finally, I know you've probably heard this from us before, but there is still time, a little bit of time, to submit a public comment to the EPA on strengthening the proposed carbon standard. UCS experts are doing an online discussion on October 1st with those who are interested in learning more about our analysis of the rule and how you can submit comments to the EPA. And we'll be sending out an email invitation on that next week, so please watch your inbox for that invitation. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. I hope, and thank you to our speakers very much, and hopefully you can join us Thursday, September 25th on our Google Hangout on careers in science policy, so you can hear from the experts who work in science policy on what they wish they knew when they were students. Thank you again, everyone, for coming, and have a great rest of your day.